Here at the Giver Marketing Network, we don't leave you drifting out in space. We connect you to a coach who will help you build and grow your marketing business. Our process acts as a guide on how to connect with other businesses, maintain good relations, and establish a presence on the Giver Marketing Network. Each member within this collaborative group will have the opportunity to leverage your talent and influence, a true network effect. If you are looking to collaborate on more projects, welcome to the Giver Marketing Network, the most trusted and highest rated collective of specialists on the planet. Here we have a group of like-minded professionals who focus on making valuable introductions and helping each other grow by teaming up. Imagine Upwork meets a network and a coach. The talent collectively includes services like visibility and SEO, creating logos, designing websites, managing social media, outreach messaging, visual storytelling, and much more. Think of what you could do with laser-focused allies strengthening your business while offering your talents to the entire network. Click near this video for more information.
Hey y'all, we are so excited today. Welcome. This is our Giver Marketing broadcast. We're working on marketing topics every Tuesday and we are so excited. Hey David.
Hey Christine. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. We love collaborating. You know that. Say hi to our whole audience out there. We've got Kingdom Warriors, our Giver Marketers. We've got the Prepared Group. So we've got lots of fans out there and we're always happy to meet more. So we're all excited because on Tuesdays, it's about marketing and we love sharing our knowledge base with our fan base, right? So if you're a small business owner, you're in the right place. If you're a marketer, you're in the right place, right? If you're an entrepreneur, if you're looking to find out more about David, what's our topic today?
We're going to talk about monetization of podcasts.
Oh, yeah. I love it. I'm a huge fan of podcasts myself. I have one. I love producing it for my clients. So this is like a huge topic, and I'm really excited about that. How did you get involved with this, David Baer?
So I actually had a podcast back, I think it's almost 9 years ago now, all about wine. And I did about 400 episodes of that. So that was my very first podcast. That one no longer exists, but I have a podcast currently where I interview marketing agency owners and service providers. And it's sort of, embedded in the work that we do at the Prepared Group. And it is part of my desire to keep on learning every day. And every time I interview somebody, I learn something new.
I love it. So this particular topic, I'm assuming you're talking about it because you know a little bit about it.
Well, I've been doing it myself. I don't necessarily know the ins and outs of every element of podcasting, but I know enough about what I've done for my podcast that I can sort of share it from the podcast presenter, podcast host point of view, and talk a little bit about monetization from my perspective, both looking at how I was considering the monetization of my previous podcast, the wine one, and how I monetize the current one.
I love that. And I think there's a lot of people out there that have thought about doing podcasts, but they're like, does it work? I mean, do you make money at it? Do you lose money at it? It can be expensive. It can be time consuming, right? And they're not sure. They're maybe walking on that fence line on whether or not to produce a podcast. So now we have somebody who is a marketer and has their own podcast and understands what this looks like from a real perspective. So I'm really looking forward to your insights today, David.
Excellent. Well, do you want me to jump into it or is there anything else you want to cover before we go? Okay.
Let's do it.
All right. Oh, you are on it. You got the slides up and everything. So indeed, we are talking about how to monetize your podcast. I'm glad that I got the opening card accurately defining what we're talking about. Why am I the one talking about this? Well, as I just moments ago, if I can get words out of my mouth. See, I don't actually edit my podcast. I leave all the bloopers in there because it's fun. And clearly we're doing that today because we're live. So as of today, I will have recorded 209 episodes of this current podcast, which is called More Perfect Marketing. The idea behind this particular podcast, as I said, is I interview marketing agency owners and service providers. And that's important. And I'll get into a little bit more detail around why I'm interviewing that particular type of guest. The idea behind the name of this, in case the more perfect kind of is a head scratcher, it's a phrase that, Christine, is it familiar enough that you could say, I know where that's from? So I'll jump in and tell you it's from the U.S. Constitution, right? We are working toward, in the Constitution, a more perfect union. And in marketing, we are always trying to improve and refine on the things that we learn. And so that's the idea behind the name. Let's talk a little bit about why podcasting in general. You said, is it easy or is it hard to produce? I don't know what's behind it. It can be super easy to produce. A lot of people overthink it. A lot of people, are curious about, do I have the right gear? Do I have the right software to do this? And it can be easily done with things that we all have access to right now. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But I record all of my podcasts over Zoom. It's not the highest quality, but it certainly isn't low quality. And we get really good video and audio that we can then take and repurpose in lots of different ways. And that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy the podcast structure in general. It's because it's a starting point. And I can take that content, use the audio, use the video, use the transcriptions. I was going to come on and talk about AI, so I'll just throw that in here as well. I can take that transcript and run it through AI and do all sorts of things with that as well, right? So there's a lot of different things that we can do with the base source material of just a video conversation, or even a video solo presentation, if you will. I tend to like conversations because, as you'll see in a moment, it's how I have chosen to monetize my podcast. There are a lot of different ways to monetize. And let's talk about some of the sort of obvious ones. Can get people to advertise. There's, in fact, entire networks where you can join and be a part of a sort of pre-prescribed advertising network that you contribute your podcast to, and vice versa. There's a bunch of different formulas around that. You can find sponsors. If you have developed a specific niche, narrow audience that sponsors want to get in front of, and you can prove, this is an important piece, you can prove that you actually have listeners and downloads, there are people willing to, or organizations willing to sponsor. You can promote whatever you do in your business right on the podcast. And that's, it can be a self-promotional tool. There are platforms that actually enable hosts to have guests sign up and pay for access to be on a podcast. And by the way, there's plenty of podcasters who do this who actually have no audience whatsoever, but the guest gets the credibility of being interviewed that they can then take that content and use it elsewhere. And so that's another monetization round. Obviously, there's merch and you could have products that are associated with the podcast. There are a lot of podcasts which are set up so that you have free content, but if you want sort of the behind the scenes or the really good content, or the sort of extra innings, you can subscribe for that as well. So those are sort of some of the mainstream, more obvious ones that are out there.
Right. So I'm going to ask, how curious, like, how hard is it to actually get some of these predictable models that you've got listed here, right? Is this something that you really have to hunt for? Is it easy to get? I mean, how difficult did you find it to be for your podcast?
So for my podcast, I was only, so I had this wine podcast that I had originally, and the only way that I ever monetized it, and this was probably 2 years into it when I thought, oh, maybe I should do something with this list that I've been developing. I created a course about how to pair wine and food, and I sold the course, and I sold a lot of that course. But
so that's the pitching your offer, right?
Yes, correct. But the ease of access to this sort of stuff is much higher right now than it was, back in 2013, 2014, when I had my original podcast. That's because there are so many platforms that are built now to make this easy. It wasn't as easy and accessible back when I was doing it the first time around. These days, it's a plug and play environment, and a lot of the stuff that we're looking at here on the screen, there are platforms built so that you don't even have to do the setup or do the thinking. There are platforms that connect sponsors and podcasters, advertisers and podcasters, guests and podcasters, etc. Does that answer the question?
I think so, right? A lot of times people are like, what do I, right?
Yeah. And a simple Google search will show you the results for pretty much any of these things, and how there's a service out there that can help you do it. So
right. You just want to think a little bit from a marketing perspective is who else wants your audience? Right.
Correct.
You're monetizing your audience, right? So those predictable models are relying on the fact that, somebody else wants to talk to your audience too. So if you're a realtor and you're talking about real estate, well, those same people who are looking for houses are probably also needing a mortgage, right? So those are hand in hand kind of concepts on who else might want to advertise or sponsor your podcast, right?
Absolutely.
So think about who else wants your audience. Right.
Well, and this is a good example that we're going to get into in a little bit more detail in just a moment. The idea of being a realtor and wanting to get in front of a certain audience may not rely on the sort of tried and true old style monetization model. So let's talk a little bit about how else we can think about this, because there's a lot of ways that you can monetize without having anybody download or anybody sponsor or even have a lot of episodes out there. And this is really the sort of insider way that I've been doing it, which is I don't have a huge audience. I think if I looked at it, I have a few episodes where I have tens of thousands of downloads. Most of my episodes tend to have hundreds of downloads, and that's fine with me. In fact, I don't really care if I had 0 downloads, because there's this monetization source that we really don't think about all that much when we're thinking about a podcast which is being produced, one would assume, with an audience in mind. But this is the source. Guests of the podcast can be your income source, your revenue source. And there's a few different formulas for this. And I want to walk through 4 different ways that you might think about monetization through guests. And then I'll talk a little bit about specifically the one that I use is actually a combination of 3 of the 4 mostly. I think I've actually done all 4 at one point with this current podcast. So
I love it. Bring it on, David. Yeah. Let's hear it.
The very first one is probably the most obvious one to most of us, which is being able to interview somebody who then might become a client, or whatever your definition of a client is, a patient, a donor, whatever, right? And obviously you want to be able to have a conversation with somebody where it's going to be appropriate for the audience that you're broadcasting to, if there's an audience, of course, right? But the interview, the conversation, gives you an opportunity to actually hear enough about their situation, their business, their story, so that you can come at the end and say, hey, I heard you mention this, that, or the other thing, and I wonder, can we circle back? I have some ideas, right? It's an opportunity to continue the conversation and explore whether working together might be a good solution for something that you learn during the interview, right? So that's one approach. And I certainly have interviewed people on More Perfect Marketing. Again, I'm in the business of serving the people I interview, marketing agency owners and service providers. And so I've had variations on that conversation after the podcast. After we've recorded, I'll circle back and say, hey, you brought something up. I'd love to sort of, circle back to that and understand what you meant by that. And then see if there's an opening for a further conversation, right? The next one is guest to affiliate. And in this scenario, I'm talking about being able to become their affiliate, right? So it's actually host to affiliate, I guess I should have said. The idea is that often you may have a guest who comes on to your show, and you have the opportunity to make this initial connection. And then if you have an audience, you have an email list, you have listeners, you may choose to promote what they have for sale to that audience. And so that's a scenario that I don't do very much. I've done it once or twice with a couple of my guests on the current podcast. Then there's guests as a joint venture partner. And the conversation might go something along the lines of what you see on the screen. I'm not sure where we can collaborate, but I really had a great time, chatting with you. And would you be open to maybe exploring what we might be able to do together? That gives you an opportunity to continue the conversation. If they enjoyed the conversation on the podcast as much as you did, hopefully they'll say yes, right? And then finally, and this is probably the one that I utilize the most, guest to referral source. So if they have an audience that is your audience, or if they are in the business of creating a problem that you can solve, right? Not in a bad way, right? But the work that they do creates a new opportunity for a referral to you. That's a great type of guest, and obviously a great monetization angle. So are we good there? You get all four of those?
Oh, that was a lot to absorb right there. All right. Are you going to give us a case study of how that works and kind of dive in a little bit so that in case we got lost? Because that was a lot.
Sure. Well, if we go back to this first one, right? The guest as a client, this is a pretty easy to follow one, right? I interview the people who are almost always my ideal client. Mm-hmm. I'm interviewing people who I can say, hey, I got this opportunity to work together. Would this be of interest to you? Let's have a conversation about it.
Because you said that your group, the Prepared Group, works with agencies, right? So for
That's
you,
correct.
if you're interviewing an agency owner, then that kind of puts you in the same room, right?
Absolutely. And it, there's always an opportunity at the very least for me to say, by the way, do you know what I do for a living? Let's chat about it. And so if I share a little bit and they go, oh, that's really interesting, I'd love to learn more. Well, that's an opportunity for me to continue to explore whether we could serve them in some way. Right.
All right. So number one right there is invite somebody to be a guest on your show that is your ideal client.
Now, there's good ways and bad ways to do this. And I want to stress that you want to be as transparent as possible, right? You don't want to be a bait and switch. I have been a guest on plenty of podcasts where they have attempted to sign me up as a customer, and it's very uncomfortable, right? So
during the podcast?
Yeah, not during the podcast, but it basically comes off as a bait and switch. Uh-huh. And this is not right the tone that you want to set with somebody that you're hoping to turn into a client. So I'm as I approach it, very transparent about here's what I do. I don't know if this would be of interest. I'm asking permission to have that conversation, rather than I've basically had people interview me and then say, hey, it looks like you have this problem. Let's schedule a meeting. I want to sign you up for this thing. And I feel bullied into it.
Right. Immediate pitch, right?
It feels like they're taking advantage of the principle of reciprocity by saying, well, I did you a favor by interviewing you. Now you have to do me a favor by giving me money for the thing that I have to sell. Right. We don't want to put anybody in that position. So.
Right. If it's if it makes sense and it's part of the conversation, hey, you want to talk about, sure. And you further the conversation, that makes perfect sense. But like you said, that feeling of obligation doesn't feel good, right? Correct. Nobody feels good that way.
Correct. So the guest to affiliate, I think this is a pretty obvious one. It's do they have something that I can share? I have not done a lot of this, but it is a monetization option, particularly if you have an audience, right? If you have people you have the ability to promote to, and this is a key, you have trained them to expect promotions from you. This is not a very good option if you don't typically make offers to an audience.
Right. You'll
or
see this a lot with influencers, right? They're used to making suggestions. They're used to having affiliate programs, right? So you have to think of yourself more than just a podcaster. Do you kind of have an affiliate and influencer mindset where you're advocating things that you think are good?
Absolutely. This one is not necessarily how we came to develop a relationship with Giver Marketing, but this could be a really good example, right? The Prepared Group and Giver Marketing have developed a partnership in one form or another as a result of, it wasn't a podcast, but a meal that my business partner had together with Timothy. And so there's an opportunity to use the podcast as sort of a initial meeting, a first conversation, and feeling each other out and saying, hey, this is, I like you, you like me, where could we take this? And so there's all kinds of possibilities with that. I probably have more JV partnerships out of my podcast than any other one of these areas. And then finally, referral partner source. I have interviewed plenty of people who are not agency owners, but who sell to or work with agency owners as well. For example, partner program managers at SaaS companies, at software tools that an agency might be involved with or might resell or might rep. And so they have an audience of their in-house partners who are all agency owners, and therefore we have an opportunity to say, hey, would it make sense for me to come in and do a presentation or do a training for your community? And that's sort of the way that I might follow up as finding a referral source.
I love it. What a great hands-on explanation you gave us there. Thank you, David.
Sure. So I want to expand this a little bit, and I'm looking at the time. I know that we have how much more time do we have? Should I race through this is the question.
Oh, don't race.
Okay. So I want to share this guy, Seth Green. He has a marketing agency just outside of Buffalo, New York. He is the co-host of the Sharkpreneur podcast. I was a guest on that podcast. He's written a lot of books about podcasts, and he's come up with an interesting formula, which if you were paying attention a moment ago, you saw the method name because I jumped a slide ahead. He calls it the Dream 50 method. So if you're familiar with Chet Holmes and the Dream 100, the idea that you can identify individuals who you would like to be able to connect with and be able to sell to. Well, this is a variation on that theme, which is identifying individuals who could be potential referral partners, joint venture partners, etc., and building out a network of those. So let's go back to that realtor example that you gave a few minutes ago, because I think this is a perfect way to illustrate this. A realtor could make connections with other business owners and influential individuals within the community where they are working, and build out a list of 50 or maybe 52, and you'll see why 50 or 52 in a moment, potential partners who they can interview on their podcast. And those individuals then can become a network to help support that realtor's business, right? So let's talk a little bit about the Dream. Of course, it's an acronym. And in this case, we're talking about first defining the target market. So finding very clearly defined individuals who would be good partners. So who is that ideal client? Who else might speak to them? The narrower you get, the better. If and when somebody goes to that link that you have been flashing on the bottom of the screen, I have an entire course that I give away. It was a 30-day challenge that we did several years ago on how to niche, how to narrow your focus in business. This is a really, really important principle that I think too few businesses leverage or take advantage of. We can have an entire other episode on that very topic. So I'm going to skip on to the R.
Well, we'll take you up on that. So
cool. Reaching out to influencers. And this is really the key is you want to find that Dream 50. These are the influencers who we're talking about. And so identifying who those influencers are over that target market that you're trying to get in front of. So if it's residents or affluent residents of a certain geographic area, if you're a realtor, right, you want to figure out who's going to have influence over them within your region, right? You could certainly, think, oh, I'm going to reach out to a big celebrity, but that big celebrity is not going to fulfill all of the needs that you have for this network of influence in a local area, right? So who's going to have that sort of influence? Maybe it's, a popular high-end restaurant owner in your neighborhood. Maybe it's the golf club general manager. Those types of individuals could have access to and influence over the type of client that you may want to serve as a realtor in a certain area. The E, so engage through interviews. This is obviously doing the production of the podcast. And we talked a little bit earlier about the platforms that you can use are accessible to all of us. We can easily, you can do this on a free Zoom account. Right? You have 40 minutes that you can record, or you can be on a call with somebody. That's very easy to do. There are free platforms on the web to be able to edit the audio. I use a tool called Audacity that I've downloaded from the web. It's 100% free. I can post it on YouTube. I can post it on LinkedIn. You can post it to podcast platforms, and there's a lot of networks that you can use to create a feed. There are plenty of free ones. There's a lot of paid ones as well. And then giving your guests access to be able to promote these episodes is sort of the key to the next step, which is getting out in front of their audience. All right. So then you want to obviously take a look at, is this working, right? We all want to do this as marketers. We want to look at what we've put together and do some analysis and make adjustments where we learn, things aren't working and dial up the things that are working as well. Right. I think the last point here, the stay adaptable to change, not just in market trends, but overall, if you lock too much in when you get going with a process like this, and you can't be flexible, you can't change, you can't respond to opportunity, you box yourself in. And so I'd say that as you're building out a system like this, feel free to be able to pivot in a different direction. I think we can start using the word pivot again. Like it's been enough.
It was a little overused there for a short while. Yeah.
And so I think that's important to have some flexibility. And then finally, monitor and expand the influencer network. So we talked about 50 individuals or 52 individuals, and that's because you can easily do this over the course of a year, once a week, and you have a wealth of content, a wealth of access to influencers, to referral partners, to joint venture partners in whatever business you're in. There's people who have the audience that you want, as you pointed out, Christine, earlier, but also may be the ones who, as I said, create the problem that you solve for their clientele. And therefore, they would be a logical sort of referral partner to pass along that customer base in a referral form to you. Now, there's one additional thing that Seth, who I shared a little bit about earlier, does. And this is actually a service that he has created in his agency. You take the podcast and you do this entire system that we've talked about, right? Identifying individuals, building out a network, creating all that content. But we talked earlier about the idea of how easy it is to repurpose that content. Well, one of the methods that Seth teaches, and I know other people do this as well, is to gather all of the material that's been put together over the course of the year and transform it into a book. And what do you do with that book? Well, you give it to all of the people who were part of that journey with you, all of your guests. And what do they do with that book? Well, they give it away as gifts to other people. And this is an authority reinforcement tool. It's a referral tool. It's a mechanism that you can take all of that content that you've done with people and now put it in the hands of these partners who can then work on your behalf to get your name in front of your ideal client who they have influence over.
I love this. I'm just going to say, because I was listening to you and I'm like, yeah, but you haven't talked about maintaining those relationships. Boom.
There you go. Yeah, and there's a lot of ways. So this is one of the clients that Seth had in his agency. This guy, I think, is a CPA. And so he's built out, a network of all kinds of individuals who have influence over business owners. Right, because he can then work with all of those as clients as well.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things is rather than doing an interview and then bye, see ya, right? If you want to have that as a person of influence in your circle, you have to maintain that relationship. And this is a great way to do that, in addition to all your other typical networking style relationship maintenance.
Yep, 100%. So I'm happy to answer whatever questions. I do have something that I mentioned earlier, and you've been flashing on the screen as well to share with the audience. For those who are interested, I have a couple of gifts, actually. I should have said getdavidsgifts.com. Maybe I'll have to go and claim that domain as well. I have a cheat sheet. It's a 26, it's A to Z, so one for every letter of the alphabet. Different cheat sheets on different topics around business building and marketing. It sort of runs the gamut from pricing strategy to positioning to email marketing and all kinds of things. I actually don't remember if I have much about podcasting in there. And then as I also mentioned, there's access to all of the training videos that I put in our 30-day challenge around how to niche, how to focus your marketing efforts in front of a narrower audience. And that's available for anybody who visits getdavidsgift.com. It is an opt-in, and as the result of getting those, you also join my More Perfect Marketers newsletter, which is a weekly newsletter that I send out. And there's a little bit of AI stuff peppered into those as well, those emails.
Get davidsgift.com. So click on that. Even if you don't have time to look at it, open it up, let it sit on your browser. And you have 50 tabs open. You'll get to it at some point today, but click on it now. This way you've got it open. You can get to it later. I love that. That's a ton of resources available for us. That's awesome. Thank you so much, David, for making that available to
my great pleasure.
Our fan club out there, right? Well, so if everybody had a chance to get that, we'll scroll it across the screen one more time, but we'll pull that down and let's bring some of our marketers into the room because you shared a wealth of knowledge with us. And here we go. Hello, guys. Welcome to the party. Well, so anybody, what was going through your mind as you were listening to David talk today about podcasting and monetizing it? What's jumping out at you?
Well, it was really cool to watch, to see this, because I've never looked at monetizing any, like I've done podcasts, a few of them actually, but I've never actually looked at monetizing them. I did them for fun. And just because I enjoy having conversations with people. And it was just interesting to even look at the world as like, oh, hey, this could actually, this could turn into money, or two, it's like the idea of actually using it to write a book is not something I would have ever thought of. I know that when Christine interviewed me a few months back, I actually turned it into a free PDF that I give out. And I never. So when you turn something into a book, what does that look like? What does that process look like, David?
So there's a bunch of ways to do it. The easiest way to do it is to simply take the transcript of each episode and have that conversation be the chapter of the book. And maybe, go in and add an intro paragraph to sort of set it up, give it some context. That's the simplest way. that's what Seth was doing 2 years ago. I imagine that you could easily do the very same thing, running it through AI and asking it to transform and reformat the content of the conversation into, a more logical structure that isn't a transcript where you're just sort of reading the conversation.
Yeah.
I guess the difference would be between if it was going to be written like a play, right? So-and-so, and then so-and-so says, right? Or if it's going to be more of a paragraph format, or if you were going to change it a little bit more even and make it into like best practices according to that person on this topic. I mean, so you have some flexibility, I would think, with the content, but I love this idea.
And there's different structures that I think if you look at great business books, there's a formula, there's a framework to the way that you structure the book overall and individual chapters, and the way that you reveal information, back it up. And you could take a transcript and use AI to adapt it into whatever framework you want. And that might be a very useful tool. But again, it really depends on what the mechanism for the book's existence is in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Most of these books that are produced as a result of podcast for authority building or authentication, nobody reads them.
Hey, David, I got a quick question for you. Is in thinking out loud, was just kind of running through my mind. You were talking about niching down in vertical markets and using the podcast to enhance your marketing there. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. For example, we've gotten deep into the manufacturing kind of niche, doing marketing for manufacturers and helping them with their distribution channels. And, so my mind was going to, do I pull a client in? Do I talk about a success story? I mean, what would be your introduction to inviting a guest onto your podcast in some type of vertical or niche market strategy?
So I would say yes to both of those examples, because there's going to be interest in the audience of prospective clients. So there's kind of two pieces. There's creating the content, and then there's making sure the content gets in front of the right audience, right? In the scenario that I just mapped out, where we were talking about the Dream 50, getting influencers, they're going to naturally set up they're going to have a desire to want to share, hey, I was on a podcast and I shared my story, and send it out. And we reinforce that by giving them materials to promote it. So there's that element of what you might want to do, is figure out, how do I get this stuff in front of an audience that may not even be looking for it? And so that's something that I think would work separately. But as soon as you start doing a case study interview with a client about a success story, the other thing that I would say might make sense is interviewing other businesses who support manufacturers in areas where you don't. So operations efficiency, things like, that are going to be of interest to the decision maker within a manufacturing organization, who also might have influence over bringing you in as a service provider. Right. That's a great person to interview, or, some specialist in areas that they're going to generally have interest. Is that making sense?
Yeah, total sense. Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's always something that we don't really think about, is using our referral partners or power partner type models in an interview process to reach your vertical niche. I think those are great insights, David. Thank you.
So there's two things that you want to think about there, because one is that you use that interview of let's say the efficiency expert to lure in somebody who has interest there. But you also can then have a conversation with the efficiency expert, particularly if they specialize in manufacturing, right? About who could they make introductions to? What other opportunities do you have to work together? And so there's two different ways that you can use that content that you create with them.
Fantastic.
Wow, there's so much processing in my head right now. I love podcasting. I love producing it for my clients, right? And now you've just like opened me up to new ideas on things to suggest. I'm like, hey, what if, right? So my mind is blown at the moment. I'm just going to say thank you, David. And I love this space. So I'm like, oh, books, AI, right? There's so many different things. So really, like you're talking about strategy. Right now it's time to strategize. So if you've been thinking about doing a podcast and you're not sure like where to get started. So let's say we have a brand new business owner. Okay. They're new. They don't really have a lot of connections. What do you think? Starting a podcast?
Well, so Joel asked just a moment ago about like, I don't know who to ask or where to begin or how I think one of the questions that you asked, which I didn't address, was how do I even go about getting somebody to agree to be my guest or something like that. So Christine, the question that you just raised about brand new business, well, this is the perfect opportunity to go out and make an introduction. Hey, I've just opened a business. I have a podcast. I wonder if you would be open to being a guest on my podcast, right? It's an easy yes for most potential guests to say yes. Now, I'll go back to that caveat I had earlier about the bait and switch thing, because this just happened to me yesterday. I had somebody reach out to me on LinkedIn. They asked me that they were sort of I can't remember what their title was, but they were the outreach person for some podcast. And they asked, hey, I really love your content. I've been following you. There was no proof or evidence that they actually had. This was probably pro forma, sort of, and then they said, so-and-so, the host of this podcast, would love to have you on as a guest to talk about, and they did fill in actually like my specialties, the areas that I know stuff about. So at the very least, some tool that they had scraped my LinkedIn profile to know what I was a specialist in.
That's right. There was some good AI attached to that somewhere.
But then the next step in the process was go fill out this form, and the form hinted to me things like, oh, they're asking questions that are setting me up for being sold to. And so I said, I looked at the forum, and then I wrote back and I said, this is probably not a good fit. Thank you anyway for reaching out. But we have to be careful about how we present ourselves, and something that we may not intentionally want to convey in the process that we have for inviting somebody on to be a guest, right? We have to be sensitive to how is somebody going to respond to what we put out there. And this is true in marketing in general, and this is just one extra layer that we have to think about when we're extending an invitation to people.
Absolutely. And I like to use it as a follow-up for me, right? So it's thank you for being on the podcast. Appreciate it. If you'd like to further have a conversation about, here's my pro bono link we can have a chat, right? That kind of thing. Because like you said, it doesn't feel good and it feels icky. It's like, oh, and I've gotten that hard sell before also. So I know what you're talking about. Yeah, so doing it all smooth. All right, so we're saying if you're a new business owner, you can do this. If you're an established business owner, you can do this. So really, is there any reason for anybody not to do a podcast? I'm just going to say.
Well, there's tons of reasons, including, are you
uncomfortable? David, you're going to have to convince me.
Yeah. Are you uncomfortable in the environment? Do you like talking to people? I mean, one of the things that Seth talks about in his service is he actually had people who signed up for his service, and then they got stage fright, so they didn't show up as the host, as the interviewer for the appointments that they had set. Right? You have to be mentally prepared for going through this process on a weekly basis, and also all of the pleasantries and housekeeping around being a host, right? Making sure that you are gracious and welcoming and all of those, that takes some practice, and you make some mistakes, and you have to have a certain amount of agility to be able to recover from and clean up from those messes. And that's all going to happen if it's your first time out doing this.
Absolutely. Nothing goes perfect the first time, right? And that's okay, right? If you have to be comfortable with that, though, like you said, as an extrovert, what do you mean people don't like to be on podcasts? I don't understand, right? No, but it's true, right? It's not for everybody, and it's okay, right? And finding your comfort zone. I know some of it, if you're a little bit more on the shy side, or maybe you don't like to be in the spotlight, you might need something more gentle, right? And gently ease into it, because I have had people not show up. They've signed up to be on the podcast and then last minute panic and like reschedule for 2 months down the road. And then 2 months after that, I had somebody reschedule, I want to say probably 3 times. And they're finally like, you know what, I'm just not even going to reschedule. And I just laughed. I'm like, okay, if you're not ready, I get it. Right.
Yeah. This is, so I was talking about hosts not showing up, but guests not showing up is actually a chronic problem. And suddenly, you know, I find that I have 45 minutes that I had planned to do something free, and I'm kind enough to sit there and wait for 10 minutes, send them or call them on the phone because I asked them for a phone number, and after that, then I sort of send off a kind message saying, I'm sorry that for some reason there was a confusion with the schedule. If you'd like to reschedule, here's a link. It's rare that I ever get those people rescheduling.
David, as a follow-up, when it's kind of a saying that follows me around, is that there's always someone out there that knows more about what you're talking about than you. And so I use that as a catalyst to ask the question, how do we get those people to participate and engage and become more involved in conversations? You know, is there a call to action? Is there a transition, right, where you've now introduced the topic, but now you can invite experts to participate in some way? What is kind of your mechanism for that?
Are you saying that those individuals are your guests on the podcast, or they play some other role?
Or maybe to become a guest, or to provide more depth of conversation, you know, to become followers or part of your audience, or, you know, how to keep them engaged with you?
So there's a few different scenarios that I've seen. Some work better than others. One, I was on a podcast as a guest a few years ago, and I was invited to join their group, and it was actually obligatory, right? If you're a guest, you have to come into the Facebook group and be active and engage with members who are in the Facebook group. Now that's a non-starter. I can see you shaking your head, right? That's a non-starter for some people. I have plenty of specialists who are guests in areas of marketing that I have no expertise in whatsoever. Influencer marketing is an area that I really, frankly, don't. I was going to say I don't care about. I actually don't, but it's not as interesting to me because of the types of businesses that I tend to focus on serving. It's not as relevant a channel. So I have had several guests come on and tell me lots of really cool, fascinating things. And if I look at my stats, those are actually the episodes that have gotten the most listens, the most downloads. So I regularly invite people who know a heck of a lot more than I do in certain narrow areas around marketing. That's really great. Do I have an opportunity to engage with them further? Part of the test is how well do we get along during the podcast recording session, and is there interest on their part to continue the conversation? So I don't know that there's a universal answer to that. Part of, you know, it's part of that know, like, and trust. I don't really necessarily want to have a relationship with everybody I've interviewed, but there are some that, like, we hit it off and we become best friends, and I have developed a lot of really solid relationships with people who are expert in areas that I have had no experience in or no knowledge of prior to me interviewing them.
So in general, as an audience building strategy, do you find the podcast mechanism is a catalyst for continuing to layer on incrementally more and more audience?
That's not my strategic approach. The audience is simply a side benefit to the approach that I've taken. If you go back to the focus that I talked about earlier, my focus is developing a relationship with the person I'm interviewing. I don't care if anybody's listening at all. I happen to have people who listen. And what I've discovered over time as I'm doing audience surveys, I started off with an audience of professional service providers because I was serving financial advisors and people in that world. What has happened over the 2+ years that I have been doing this particular podcast is I have more and more of my ideal client, marketing agency owners and service providers. I don't have a week that goes by where I don't get an email, a LinkedIn outreach on one of the guest matching platforms saying, I've listened to this interview and I think I would be a great guest. Now, again, some of that is sort of pro forma in terms of outreach, right? You want to have evidence, but some of it is actually sincere. And I know that because when I get onto a recording session with some of my guests, part of my housekeeping is to say, this is a something you can take if you wish. I'll say, I just want to go through sort of the structure of the podcast so that you know what we're about to do. But you may not know that if you've listened to any episodes. Have you? Gives them an opportunity to say, yes, I have. And several of them say, yes, I have. In fact, I just listened, in preparation for this episode. And then we talk for 5 minutes about the content of that episode. So I get a sense that, and so I have actually a large number of people who are marketing service providers listening to my podcast now. I didn't do anything active aside from whatever automation goes out that every time a new episode airs, and sending my guest a social share, image and a link to the episode.
Fantastic. It's really, really fun and enriching to hear someone, kind of from an experiential point of view, discussing how they've kind of utilized a tool like this to enhance their business model, without coming out and saying this is how you have to do it and it's $10,000 and have a nice day.
Well, it's nice to see that there's more than one way, right? Now, when we think of podcasts, we think, downloads, viewers, number, right? I've got to get advertisers, right? It gives it a different perspective, right? Are you using it to open doors? Are you using it to build relationships? Are you using it to further those relationships? How are you using it? So I love the open-mindedness to it, David. Thank you for giving us a fresh perspective on monetizing your podcast.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share.
Absolutely. Let's run it one more time across the bottom. So if you're looking for the free gifts from David, get davidsgift.com. And there's lots of goodies in there he's got. So feel free to reach out. And David, you said you are looking for people to interview on your show. Is that right?
I'm always open to interviewing marketing agency owners and service providers. I have, I think I'm booked out until the beginning of February on guest recordings right now. But after that, we should be opening things up. And I do use a couple of platforms that connect me with guests, particularly Podmatch is the place where I find most of my guests. And it's a place where I can qualify somebody in terms of the experience that they've had as a guest and get a little bio and do some research. So I'm overwhelmed, as I imagine you are, Christine, with emails from, bookers who have the perfect guest for me, but have never actually done anything except, found my name on some list and start cold emailing me.
Come on now. We all love cold emails, don't we? Thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom and your experience with us, David, today. We really appreciate it. And just a reminder to everybody, today is Tuesday. It's our marketing broadcast. However, tomorrow is Wednesday. Wednesday is networking for marketers. So don't be a lonelypreneur. If you're a marketer, come hang out with us. We meet on Wednesdays, same time as our show here. So 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. So go to givermarketing.com/networking, sign up, add us to your calendar and come hang out with us. Don't be a lonelypreneur, because we're all here to collaborate and have fun together. Thank you so much, y'all, for hanging out with us with Giver Marketing Network, and we will see you next Tuesday.